Azadeh Zabeti. Welcome to Iran, the Untold Story Podcast, where I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Congressman Patrick Kennedy. Congressman Kennedy served as a Democratic member of the House of Representatives from Rhode Island's 1st Congressional District from 1995 to 2011, and was in fact the first Generation X member of Congress when he was elected in 1995. He's a mental health advocate, amongst other advocacies, and is the co-founder of the not-for-profit One Mind. Congressman Kennedy, it's an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for joining me.
Likewise, great to be with you.
Congressman, perhaps if we could start off, I'd like to begin with your relationship with the Iranian Resistance. I understand that you have been a supporter for some 15 or so years. And I wondered if you could begin by telling our listeners and our viewers what first motivated you to support the resistance and the cause of freedom for Iran.
Well, in fact, my support stretches back much further than that, because when I was a member of Congress, I would often sign on to amnesty letters. Of course, these were the letters on behalf of political prisoners really all over the world. And the great privilege of being in Congress is that you could use some of your influence to highlight these individual stories of people who were jailed simply because of their political positions. And of course, in the United States of America, we couldn't imagine a world where the government could come in, sweep you away in the middle of the night, put you in jail, and your family never know whatever happened to you, let alone put you to death. And so I signed on to a number of letters on behalf of members of the MEK who were incarcerated over in Iran, and other political prisoners who are doing nothing more than fighting for freedom for their countrymen in Iran, to fight against any kind of fascism and dictatorship. And of course, initially the Shah, oppressed people. And then, of course, the mullahs came in and promised a new Iran where the people would finally have freedom of expression and greater freedom than what they had under the Shah. And they were quick to find out that, unfortunately, things got even worse for the people of Iran. And as we've seen over the decades, the theocratical fascism of the mullahs has wreaked havoc on not only the people of Iran, but because Iran has become the largest state sponsor of terrorism, it has been a pariah internationally. And it's so especially tragic because the Persian people have always been at the forefront of creating civilization as we know it, as the most learned of countries. And it's just so contradictory that you have these people who are running Iran that are trying to bring it back to the Stone Age amongst a population that is so well educated, is so anxious to have, civil liberties and rights for all people, that, such a progressive population is being run by such a Neanderthal group of thugs. Basically, they are bullies in the plainest terms. There's nothing redeeming about an organization that is simply like organized crime. They rule by intimidation, they rule by violence, and they can't stomach getting the people's actual votes. So they have to rig elections, and they have to incarcerate political opponents because they know they would never win in a democratic election, that they're simply holding on to power by force. And unfortunately, Iran is not alone in that. We know there are many countries around the world that In fact, the norm, unfortunately, in the world is dictatorship. And needless to say, I wrote many of those letters. When I finished Congress, we were in a precarious position because of the war in Iraq. And we then saw that the fallout from the war in Iraq was that Iran had now unfettered access to run militias in Iraq. And we saw them extend their influence into Iraq. And we saw the community of Ashraf really threatened by this because they were no longer safe, because even though they were in Iraq, they were now vulnerable to these militias and the Iranian Guard. And essentially, we were fighting to make sure that those people who were living in Ashraf, really people that had been fighting, really, this terrorism of the mullahs, were now really no longer safe. So I joined a number of my colleagues, not only in the United States, but from around the world, to try to make sure they could get safe passage out of Iraq. And of course, we tragically were late in getting many of them out because the Iraqi government was so dominated by the Iranian mullahs that they succeeded in killing so many members of Ashraf. So, it's been a long struggle. We're happy that we have a new Ashraf in Albania, in Tirana, but we also know that doesn't mean that people are safe. We're seeing the influence of Iran against the Ashrafis exerted through the government of Albania. We have to thank the government of Albania for opening their doors, but we also have to realize that the influence of Iran is so great that we have to keep fighting to protect them. Then we have the whole issue of global terrorism. And of course, right now we're seeing the Middle East go up in flames because of Iran's provocation funding, basically, not only Hezbollah, Hamas, and many other terrorist groups to destabilize the region. And what's the ultimate result of that? The ultimate result is innocent people being killed. The very people that purportedly Iran's trying to help are being sacrificed, unfortunately, for some, ideological kind of movement that the mullahs want to extend their influence. And as a result, you have tens of thousands of people killed because of their provocations, and the inhumanity of Hamas, where the leader of Hamas said he didn't mind sacrificing as many Palestinians as he needed to in order to win the hearts and minds of the world and turn everyone against Israel. So it's really barbaric that the very people who purport to be the leaders are actually the ones that are the biggest enemy of the people that they're leading. I mean, just end with this, but you cannot make up the fact that Iran is the leader, not only of state-sponsored terrorism, but they lead the world in the number of executions of their own people. And so it's important that the world community isolate them. It's a fight that has to go on. And I really want to thank the resistance to keep the pressure on, because really it's been through the resistance that we, in not only America, but throughout Europe, have been educated about what's really going on. And of course, dictatorships like Iran are able to get away with what they're able to get away with because people are not paying attention. But thanks to the MEK and to the National Council on Resistance, we find that these secrets, the 1988 massacres, the secrets of who's really running the country and all the people that are getting killed, then, unfortunately, this would go by and people wouldn't know. But thanks to the resistance, the world knows about it, and it makes it easier for us to put pressure on Iran, which is what we need to continue to do.
And you've spoken of the decades of association that you have in terms of human rights advocacy for the Iranian people. And I wondered if I may ask you whether and really how your father, the great Senator Ted Kennedy's views and his actions regarding human rights, how that affected your stance towards the Iranian resistance and your motivation to really become such a staunch advocate?
Well, in my family, President Kennedy wrote the book While England Slept. And it was a book that documented how England never prepared for Hitler, and they were really caught off guard and we almost lost the world to that kind of fascism of Nazi influence. And so the question was, how could we have let this happen? And even when you had Chamberlain try to negotiate with Hitler, what did he realize? Well, everyone realized that you can't negotiate with someone like Hitler. And what ended up happening is, of course, Hitler exploited the whole effort to bring peace because he was never interested in peace. And of course, you can see the parallels in all of that with what's happening in Iran. They're not interested in negotiating. They want their way. And unfortunately, only force will repel them, and only pressure will repel them. Now, my father was a great champion of human rights around the world. He was the leader in putting pressure on the apartheid government of South Africa to really bring about Nelson Mandela and a country that then finally included all the people, although the challenge still is ongoing. My father led an effort in the United States Senate to isolate the apartheid regime. And if you think about it, whether it was that or his standing up against Pinochet in Chile, Pinochet would round up all of his political opponents and execute them, in the stadium down there. They disappeared. There was this thing called the disappear. They were all the sons and daughters of the Chilean people who just disappeared. They could never find out what happened to them. And again, you could see the parallels with Iran. And of course, there are many, many other stories around the world where he stood up for those that were oppressed. Obviously, I'm, so grateful for that legacy. And I want to obviously keep it going because it's a proud part of my family legacy.
I've actually come across a letter from your father back in June of 1984, so really exactly 40 years ago. And it's a letter that he has addressed to Mr. Masoud Rajavi and to the National Council of Resistance of Iran. And I say it's wonderful because he pledges his support, for the human rights and fundamental freedoms of Iranians, but also for the cause of freedom and democracy. And it's extraordinary, as I say, given that it was so soon after the Iranian Revolution, when really news of the reign of terror and the executions that were taking place were at that time little known in the West. So your father very much a pioneer in that respect. Could you perhaps provide some context on your father's involvement on Iranian human rights and human rights in general, but in particular with Iran, given this extraordinary letter?
Yes, well, Masoud Rajavi was obviously an inspirational leader for democratic movement in Iran, and my father was always attracted to people who were fighting really against the odds, and frankly, at the risk of their own lives. Um, he really admired that. You can have people just be quiet and turn the other way because, frankly, it's easier and they don't jeopardize their lives or those immediately around them. But he really admired people like Nelson Mandela, Masood Javi, and many others who were standing up for a newer world where people did not have to live under such oppression and under such violence. And of course, I know that he was a great student of history and appreciated the powerful history of the Persian people, and what an anathema to that history the mullahs represented. They were such a throwback to a Stone Age approach of ruling by violence, and that he just absolutely abhorred that type of leadership. And he was, I think, so proud that his godfather, my Uncle Joe, died fighting the Nazis in World War II. He was only 27, and he never got to have a family. He never got to have a full life, but he laid his life down on behalf of democracy and freedom, and to fight the kind of violence and tyranny and terrorism that Hitler represented. And I think to my father, Masoud Rajavi represented that type of courageous individual who was trying to lead his countrymen to a new day when their country did not have to be run by such thugs as the mullahs, who pretended to invoke the name of God while they were killing God's children. It's just really incredible fact that here you have people who pretend to be religious, but who traffic in the most horrendous human rights abuses. It's just, how they can hold a straight face to think that they're, holy people when all they do is spend their lives injuring, torturing, killing their own people.
It's truly shocking, as you say. I have seen, given that you've accepted this baton from your father and this incredible family legacy of speaking up for justice and for accountability and for human rights and fundamental freedoms, I've seen footage of you traveling to events where you've been speaking, where you've traveled with your young family. And I wondered whether you could share with our listeners and viewers perhaps a memorable experience or an interaction that's really solidified your commitment to the cause of a free, a democratic, and a secular Republic of Iran.
Well, I remember when I brought my baby first child to one of the rallies in Paris. Madame Rajavi said that my little son was going to be a fighter for Ashraf because, he was there in the rally when we were fighting that great battle to protect the people of Ashraf. And of course, he came with me and the rest of my kids just a year ago to Paris, and and it was such a learning experience for them. I really love the opportunity to show my kids what courage, what legacy means, to never take for granted the world that we understand to be ours, because frankly, it's not the world that most people in the world have to live with. We are very blessed and privileged to live in freedom and democracy. And as everyone knows, democracy isn't perfect, but as Winston Churchill said, democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. And it's really true. We have a struggle, and I, really admire the fact that I can show my children this great heroic people who are still fighting, really against long odds. But you think about where we've come, and you realize that the national protests in Iran of young people, you really get to appreciate the courage of young women who are no longer willing to just be harassed and dominated simply because they are women, not given the equal rights as men. And, I can tell that fight to my daughters, and they can see Madam Rajavi up there and in wonder that, this woman, this very powerful woman, is helping to lead democracy. And, it has an impact on, I think, the consciousness. You can't ever tell what it is that pierces these children's minds and hearts, but I can tell you, I love to put, powerful women in the life of my young girls, because I want them to feel empowered themselves and not subjected to such misogyny as unfortunately women in Iran have been subjected to under the mullahs.
And you've mentioned Mrs. Rajavi and shared this really lovely story of taking your firstborn child, newborn, to meet her. You have met Mrs. Rajavi on numerous occasions over the years. I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about your views of Mrs. Rajavi, perhaps her leadership style, and also what values she stands for.
Yes, well, I have been grateful in my life, coming from the family that I've come from, to really witness so many extraordinary political leaders. And it takes such a unique set of qualities to be a leader. You cannot lead by, demand. You've got to lead by example. And you cannot lead by raising your voice. You have to lead by having people be interested in listening to what you have to say. And with Madam Rajavi, she's so approachable. She's so easygoing, but don't let that manner of easy approachability ever confuse you for the strength and steel that is behind Madam Rajavi. And everybody knows that. And it's so powerful when you don't have to raise your voice to be heard. And Madam Rajavi has, I think, been a symbol, and she understands that. She knows the power shift of having a woman lead a resistance effort that at its very core shatters the idea of this kind of paternalistic, misogynistic kind of regime that oppresses women, oppresses all people in Iran. And so it's such an existential threat to the mullahs to have their leading opposition be led by a woman. And in a way, it's really poking their eye. And I absolutely love the fact that she is the one that is kind of coalescing, all the resistance groups behind a common cause. And I just say, as a former elected official, you can really see the power of a campaign. A campaign is really bringing different stakeholders together in common cause. If you don't have kind of unified effort, you diminish the real power that comes from a collective enterprise. If everyone was on their own and screaming and yelling, no one would really hear them as much as if they came together through the voice of Madam Rajavi. And she's able to do that because no one's threatened by her. They really have loved Madam Rajavi. They love what she's trying to do. They see how sincere and earnest she is. And that attracts people to the cause, which, thanks to her, is so much more powerful and effective as a result.
And later this month, at the end of June, there will be a gathering of some 100,000 or so people who will be meeting in Berlin at the annual Free Iran Summit organized by the National Council of Resistance of Iran, who Mrs. Rajavi leads. And your uncle, John F. Kennedy, again in June, this time on the 26th of June, 1963. June seems to be the theme in our podcast today. But in a very, very famous speech, he said in Berlin, "Ich bin ein Berliner," I am a Berliner. And you at past meetings and rallies have said, "Man Ashrafi Hastam," I am an Ashrafi. I wondered if you could elaborate on why you said that.
Well, obviously, I think President Kennedy captured really the imagination of the world, who was trying to understand why the fight for freedom in Europe and in particularly in Berlin, which was really the front lines of East versus West, of, the former Soviet Union and the communism, and they all had this big, wall, the Berlin Wall, that represented the failed policies of dictatorship, to be able to have to build a wall to keep your people from escaping. And so President Kennedy really wanted to make clear to the world that you didn't have to be a Berliner to care about this. We all are human beings. We're all bound as human beings to each other. Some of us were born in different parts of the world, but we're all part of a great human family. And he was able to capture that by saying, "I am a Berliner." It's so powerful. You have a United States president hailing from an ancestral homeland in Ireland, but in common cause with people who are fighting for freedom and saying, "Ich bin ein Berliner." And so I thought how appropriate, times change, but sometimes the struggle remains the same. And of course, we know the famous adage that those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And so I thought we should not look at the Ich bin ein Berliner as a historical event alone. We should look at it as a call to action today in our own lives, because the fight is not in Berlin. Our fight today is in Tehran. Our fight today is protecting innocents around the world from Iran's brutality and terrorism. So that's why, I have said Man Irani Ashraf, because I have felt that the people of Ashraf are people that any one of us, if we were stuck in their situation, would want others to speak up for. And Man Irani Hastam as well, for the fact that people in Iran have felt like they are oppressed and no one knows or cares about them. And so I always like to say Man Irani Hastam, because, we're all of our fight is with them. If I were in Iran with my 5 children and wife, I would not be able to live worrying about my children being executed every single day, worrying about, the freedoms of my wife, my children, their futures. And so just because I didn't grow up in Iran doesn't mean that their cause isn't my cause. It's the cause for all people to fight for each other, because if we don't fight for each other, who is left to fight for us? And that was another great quote from Martin Niemöller. First they came for the gypsies. I was not a gypsy, so I didn't speak out. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I was not a trade unionist, so I didn't speak out. Then they came for the Jews, and I was not a Jew, so I did not speak out. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out. And so we live in a small world, and we have to stand up for each other, because we never know when we're the ones that are going to be on the line. And would we want others to ignore us just because we lived in a different place? I don't think so.
Really moving words, and that I am an Ashrafi and I am an Iranian, obviously words that mean so much to the people of Iran, who do see a great deal of the footage of events from satellite TV stations. And I think that support and that solidarity means so much, as you say, as it shows that they're not alone, and, we are one human family. Given that you've supported the NCRI really since your days on Capitol Hill, this has been a cause for you. How have you seen the movement evolve during that time? Have you seen any changes that spring to mind?
Well, it's clear that, as I mentioned, the NCRI, MEK have really been the organized effort to really speak and organize, not just on the outside in getting international pressure brought on the mullahs, but also organizing in the inside of Iran. And I think everyone over and over has been especially impressed with how effective the NCRI has been in putting out amongst the people of Iran the idea that they're not alone. And in fact, through their communications system, in spite of the, jamming and the blocking of all freedom of speech in Iran, in spite of that, it has been so impressive to see the effectiveness of that communication, so that when you have an uprising, as we've seen over and over in Iran, everyone in Iran can know that they're not alone, that this uprising doesn't represent some isolated protest, that it represents all the people of Iran really fighting this incredible dictatorship and terrorist regime, and standing up for the rights of people in Iran. And so I think they've really helped coalesce, as I said, and organize the people of Iran. And as such, they have helped push back on United States policy that would otherwise listen to the Iranian ambassadors say, oh, this is nothing but a small, isolated, group, right? That's been the Iranian kind of propaganda all along, is that really this is just a small, isolated group. Well, you can't say that and see what's going on in Iran, see the impact and the power of the NCRI, even within the country, as it organizes the diaspora at the same time. That has made such an impact. So I think the power of that organization is felt in many, many ways.
And I'm glad that you've mentioned Iran and what's going on domestically, and also really the role that has been played by the resistance units who are affiliated and associated with the MEK. That is, for our listeners, ordinary individuals in Iran who are carrying out extraordinary activities in leading the demonstrations against the Ayatollahs and the dictatorial regime of Iran. Congressman, looking ahead, may I ask you what your hopes are for the future of Iran and what message you would have for her people?
Well, I would say that when we finally break the back of this tyrannical regime, there's not going to be any worry about what the future is, because the people of Iran have already embraced and communicated what future they want. And there's going to be such a relief amongst the people of Iran. They finally get to live in a country that is run and in a democratic way that respects civil authority, and that isn't run by the military, and that really understands that the future is in the people, in the young people, in the education. And I think that is evidently just really what it's about. And these mullahs are such a tiny, tiny segment. There's really no worry that there is some opposition to democracy outside of these mullahs. So when they go, as I said, the Persian people have had a culture of education and literacy and civilization that I think will reassert itself and lead the world in the way that Iran has historically been a leader in the world. So I think we just are working and pressing, because this cannot last. This is the history of this country is going to be felt. And the sooner we put pressure and continue to put pressure on the regime, and we do not assume, as the Iranian government, the mullahs are going to say that, oh, we don't want to put sanctions on them because it'll hurt the people. Well, this is what we heard in apartheid South Africa. The people are already suffering. And if we think that we give a lot of aid and support to the regime, that somehow that's going to trickle down to the people, they want change. They don't want, trickle down. And we have to stand with the people. And I am absolutely confident that this is a change that will happen. And yet it's up to all of us to make sure it happens sooner than later. But as I said, I want everyone to know that we are stand with them, and we'll do what we can to help support their cause for a new and free Iran. And when that day comes, and I know I'll be able to take my children and really to see the antiquities, to see a country that is anew in its life and, hope about the future. It's going to feel so good to be able to see the transformation take place for the people of Iran.
And a free Iran, obviously very long overdue, given the Iranian people have now fought two successive dictatorships, the first being the dictatorship of the monarchy in Iran, and now, of course, the Theocratic Regime. I wondered what your thoughts are on those, albeit a very tiny minority of individuals who appear to be lobbying for a resurrection of a monarchical system of rule in a future Iran.
Yeah, no, it's they're living in the past. The people who think that, you can sort of restore an antiquated idea that is anachronistic to our times, the thought that we would ever trade one form of dictatorship for another form of dictatorship is just laughable. The people, when they're fighting the mullahs. They're fighting that lack of freedom, that oppression. Why would they ever choose to have that replaced by another name for oppression? They've been through this. They know it well, and they're not going to go back.
No, and I think a clear indication of that sentiment is really the unequivocal words of the Iranian people, who do consistently chant at rallies, and the graffiti all over Iran is very much no to the Shah and no to the mullahs. And as you say, they will not be looking back, but rather looking ahead. My penultimate question, really, I wondered whether you could convey to our listeners and viewers why they should, what's the importance of supporting the NCRI and getting behind Mrs. Rajavi's 10-point plan, her roadmap for a future Iran, or what a future Iran can and may look like?
Well, the importance is that you never know when that moment's going to come where you need to pull in all of the stakeholders and allies to finally be able to make the most of that moment. If you are waiting for that moment and waiting for that moment to transform everything, you're going to see that moment pass you by. But if you're mobilized, if you're prepared, when that moment arrives, and it's not going to happen in a vacuum, the moment it's going to come when so much pressure is brought to bear, and then that crack in the wall, like we saw in the crumbling of the Berlin Wall, that crack where we saw Nelson Mandela walk out of jail and right into the presidency, that these moments are going to happen. And if we're prepared, then they're going to happen sooner and in a way that is more organized and has a real ability to capture that in a positive way, as opposed to being reactive. We have to be proactive. So when there is a change, there isn't a vacuum where we don't know what's going to fill in that vacuum. We have the NCRI that's organized. In order to run a country, you need to understand where the expertise is so that it doesn't become chaotic. The great thing about NCRI and the whole movement is that they're ready. We're not going to be in a place where the doors are open and there's going to be mass chaos. Thanks to NCRI, there's going to be an ability to transition from the mullahs to a democracy according to Madam Rajavi's 10-point plan that is well laid out. They're not looking for power's sake. They're looking for power to be put back to the people and have a free and secular Iran. And that's what's so exciting about NCRI. And I commend them, and I just try to say, and it's hard for me to say, sitting in freedom, for those that are fighting and struggling, that your time will come, and we're all there with you to try to bring it about sooner than later.
And finally, Congressman, may I ask you to leave our viewers and our listeners with 3 adjectives that to you best describe the NCRI and the MEK and the resistance movement as a whole?
Well, it's clear that it's freedom, democracy, and rights. Rights of the people, rights to live in a pluralistic society where people can have democratic government, not be dictated to, and really the hope that can come when people are able to live out the full expression of their God-given potential, and not to have that potential, crushed by an inhumane leadership that does not embrace the hopes and dreams of the people that it purports to represent. In this case, people will finally be able to have a future that they can pass on to their kids with great hope and expectation, as opposed to the fear that they have to live in today for their children and their children's future. So there is nothing, close right now to anything but victory, anything but dramatic change. This cannot be a slow process. There has to be an expedited process. There's too many people who've been lost and too many people who've sacrificed their lives for us not to bring their memories to the future and tell future generations in a free Iran all about those who sacrificed their lives to give them that free country.
And that self-sacrifice and that love and that passion, obviously, for a free and a democratic secular Republic of Iran, which we do hope is not too far away. And hopefully you can visit a free Tehran with your children, which would be lovely to see. Congressman Patrick Kennedy, it's been my absolute pleasure, and I very much appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you so much.